diversity leads to innovation. The result was 100,000 products sold in less than 1 week. The most successful business case in the local market for L'Oreal. So these are kind of KPIs you can have.
Luana Génot is the founder of Instituto Identidades do Brasil, where she has trained hundreds of thousands of leaders on equity and inclusion. Today, she also helps shape Brazil's AI and climate strategy as a member of the Presidential Council for Economic and Social Development.
What was the turning point that actually led you to dedicate your career to equity and inclusion?
And I truly realized that I was like the only Black woman in the room. I wanted to dedicate my life to break those barriers down. So I hope in the future, Brazil becomes a country where a child's race, gender, or zip code no longer dictates their opportunity.
Luana, you've gone from working in advertising to founding Instituto Identidades do Brasil. My Portuguese is not the best.
You did that beautifully. Thank
you. So what was the turning point that actually led you to dedicate your career to equity and inclusion?
Well, Philip, first of all, it's a great pleasure being here with you. And when I think about the turning point for me, the turning point was basically when I was working in advertising media. And I truly realized that I was like the only Black woman in the room, basically. And I saw that there were like brilliant women that were left behind just because of structural barriers, even if they were very talented. And I think at some point, I decided that I didn't want to succeed despite those barriers. Just from a personal perspective, I wanted to dedicate my life to break those barriers down. Mm-hmm. That's why I founded the Instituto Identidades do Brasil. I wanted to have more people being able to succeed, right? So I think that was my turning point.
What's the biggest shift that you've seen actually in how Brazilian companies approach equity inclusion over the last decade?
I think when we think about the last decade, when you would see like 10 years ago, you would see diversity seen as a philanthropy or PR, as something that should be put aside. But today, we are not where we should be, but companies see more this as a strategy. And I think mostly also because our work and work of other institutions that are working in the same topic, we are putting inclusion in the core, in the center of the strategy, okay? So companies now, they have metrics that link inclusion to retention and innovation and to how they talk to their consumers. And, that's a great shift. And I think there is a lot to do still, but that was one of the greatest shifts I've ever seen. Mm-hmm. And also in terms of investing. So most of the companies would say, like, we don't have money to invest on this, or this is something that, our institutional arm would do, not our corporate would do. But now the corporate also need to deliver, things linked to their KPIs. And I think that was a great shift. But obviously a lot to do. A lot of challenges because, is it still under, HR responsibility as it should be the whole company's responsibility. A lot of things to do, but I think that was a great shift going from, something from the side to the core strategy for some companies.
Yeah. So you talked about KPIs and how some companies are already using those. But to me, it always seems that for some companies, these topics are more a little bit lip service, but they don't really create measurable impact. So what would you say, what separates those companies that actually create meaningful change from those for which it remains a lip service?
Well, lip service for me is basically when you just stick with the statements or reactions. So basically I'm saying, imagine a company that has a case that is related to harassment or racism, and goes on media, and this company needed to respond to this case. Usually, that would be something, if that is a very isolated case, I would say that's a lip service. So you react, you put a note in your social media saying that you're against all kinds of harassment or racism acts, and you are ashamed of that, and so on. This is more lip service for me, but real change for me is about systems. And a lot of companies also, they came from a case that actually led to a crisis, and they could actually turn into a systemic approach. And I truly believe in that as well. So the company that moved the needle, setting measurable goals, or redesigning, for example, recruitment pipelines, or tied executive bonuses to inclusion, and they would train people in a way that could change their behavior, that would be more systemic change. I still think I'm with you that most of companies are still in the reaction. So that's why we still have a way to go to achieve a level where companies are more into systemic change. But at least that was maybe the greatest shifts we have from 10 years ago to now. So 10 years ago, we would have more reactions, punctual reactions when you have crisis, but now we have more companies, still a few of them, but we have more companies now that are trying to do systemic changes.
Okay. And while there's a lot of progress, there's also pushback, particularly right now. When you look at the topic at the global basis, there are many countries and regions right now where there seems to be a pushback against diversity and inclusion efforts. Some companies are even scaling back their programs. So how do you make sense of this moment in time?
Well, your question is very thoughtful and needed, just because we need to think about what backlash is. For me, backlashes are the signal of progress. Every action has a reaction, right? If there was no action, there would be no reaction. So I think, also we need to be very careful on talking about things that we think that are global, and they are mostly localized in the United States, for example, because this is a very noisy kind of environment that somehow obviously influences other places, but we should actually pay attention on where it's having more noise, and where we can even have more progress, regardless the context in the United States, for example. So I think basically the reaction, just to be very responsible in answering this about backlashes, especially in the United States, I think the reaction comes especially because entrenched systems resist when they feel threatened, right? So the role of leaders, in my opinion, is to stay in the course. And basically, if you retreat now, you not only lose moral ground, but also competitiveness and increasingly diverse and global marketplace. So I think for those who think that this is a strategy, and they put this strategy in the core, in the center of their businesses, they kind of keep on going. Even if they change the names of their departments or their strategy, they keep on going. For those who paid like the lip service, as we were talking before, they kind of move and shift around. But I truly believe the fact is, if there is a backlash, it's because there was some progress, and we need to stay the course.
You brought up this topic of competitiveness, and you've said in the past a lot that equity is not just a moral issue, it's an economic one. So could you maybe share some examples of maybe also companies that you've worked with that have really gained competitive advantage or economic benefit from having these programs in place?
Absolutely. I truly believe that being more diverse make your company more competitive and more, more able to grow in different markets. So one of the a great example I have to bring here is like an example from L'Oreal. L'Oreal, in Brazil, they wanna basically sell more sunscreen, right? Sunscreen, something needed because we are in a planet that is, we have like heat, and especially in Brazil, especially in Rio, in cities like Rio, where I am from, you can get a lot of sunburn, right? But imagine someone who has a skin like mine, darker skin, right? A darker skin can be exposure to the sun as a lighter skin, right? But there is a myth that darker skinned people would not use as much sunscreen than others. So what we did as a case, we basically decided to look at their portfolio and see, oh, there is an opportunity to sell more sunscreen for people, especially darker skinned people. But we need to train the consumers, we need to train the dermatologists, we need to train the market to see more this product in the shelves. So we did this training, they invested on this, and the result was 100,000 products sold in less than 1 week. The most successful business case in the local market for L'Oreal. So just because they had a team that was like, that was receiving racial and gender literacy, and when I talk about racial and gender literacy, I mean about economics, I mean about repertoire, I mean context about the country. So to work in Brazil, you need to know that Brazil was a country where we had slavery for almost 400 years. And that's why we have so many inequalities. You need to know that we have 56% of the population that is Black or indigenous. So most of us are dark-skinned people. And there is a huge opportunity to sell products for those underrepresented groups because we are underserved. And when you look into your portfolio, you see like which kind of products, which kind of insights I can bring to sell more or reach more people. And the markets that are growing are the ones who are serving underserved or underrepresented populations that have been historically underserved in so many different ways. And when we provided them with the training to their innovation team, they were able to see their portfolio and sell more products for this underserved group. So just to give you an example, but we have many different researches that prove that companies who have more diverse teams in terms of race and gender, they perform 36% above the average. So I'm talking about the L'Oreal case, just to give a specific case, but we know that diversity leads to innovation.
Mm-hmm. You talked about some KPIs also in the beginning. So how would you measure success when it comes to equity and inclusion?
Well, there are so many different KPIs that can be connected to diversity, equity, inclusion. Some of the most commons are high representation in leadership. So because, obviously you can have a company, as I was mentioning, that Brazil is mostly Black and indigenous. We may have like a company that has 50 or 60% of Black or indigenous employees. But when you go to higher representation, you don't see any of them. So one of the KPIs would be high representation of Black and indigenous people in the leadership. Narrowing pay gaps. So basically, you may have a lot of people, especially Black, indigenous, or women, but it still have a huge pay gap. So we need to narrow this pay gap based on self-identity. So in Brazil, it's allowed to have a census and to identify how many employees you have who are Black, indigenous, or women. So you can cross the data and see how are the pay gaps you may have among Black and indigenous and other races and ethnicities, and you can have a goal to narrow this pay gap, for example. You also can have a KPI for training opportunities in terms of, training and development opportunities. So you may have, again, a base of Black and Indigenous people in your company that don't get the same level of opportunities to go and progress in your company. So you can have a KPI to make sure that the people who are in the base of your company can scale up and go and have some progress. And obviously, you can also have a more things connected to innovation, for example. And so how many products I could sell to a group of people who are underserved. So these kind of things, as I mentioned in the L'Oreal case, can be also a measure for your KPI for growing your targets, your markets, in markets that are underserved. So these are kind of KPIs you can have.
Fantastic. You also serve in Brazil's Presidential Council for Economic and Social Development. How do you bring the topics around diversity, equity, and inclusion into these high-level political discussions that also center around topics like environment and AI, for example?
Yeah, for me, Philip, I usually say that I'm a leadership that brings inclusion and color to the table. As you can see, I'm very colorful, and that's for a purpose. And also, I bring inclusion to different, macro topics. So I tie inclusion to macroeconomics. I tie inclusion to climate justice. I tie inclusion to, to the possibility of our country to grow more in the opportunities we can give to the underserved communities who are mostly Black and Indigenous. So basically, the Presidential Council would be mostly a place where I can help bring this topic connected to other macro topics that usually don't see inclusion in their core strategy. So when I think about economy, sometimes if I'm talking to other economists, they don't even think about racial inequalities, which I think that that's a pity, because to basically close the gaps of inequalities in Brazil, you gotta see how race inequalities play an important role preventing us to grow. So in the Presidential Council, basically my role is to bring this topic of inclusion that is usually excluded. And I think that especially now we are also having an AI revolution as well. And I think that we have a new opportunity to use technology, for example, to scale new tools that can help us fighting against inequalities in a more smarter way and more scalable way. So scaling, for example, conversations about racial gaps or racial exclusion and exploring new ways to close the gaps in terms of salaries, or to getting more people educated about the contexts in Brazil. Those are ways to scale this conversation, because we are a pretty big country. So scaling conversations is very, very difficult because it's a very complex country. So in a Presidential Council, in terms of getting some intersectionality of this topic of inclusion in so many different domains, but also trying to get more allies to scale up this conversation as well, especially using AI now.
When you talk about AI, the technology is often criticized for producing bias. So from your perspective, what would be a truly responsible AI look like?
Well, responsible AI for us, as we are working in scaling our own AI, is not only an AI that's less biased, So it should be mechanisms that actively corrects historical inequalities or historical, lack of repertoire. Because if you ask to any AI now, so what's a beautiful person? Or to ask references about a book or something, this AI should provide you, a range of, possibilities. But what happens is the first or the major references, the AIs, the GPTs we have now, they will provide us with references from the global north or white references. I'm saying that the problem is we can have a broader repertoire. It's not about erasing the white references or the global north references, but to add new references, for example. And this requires diverse data sets. This requires more transparency in decision making and to be actively increasing the repertoire to make sure that those AIs will answer based in a broader repertoire. And that will build new data sets and new references, especially with the community most affected. So I'm saying that, for example, indigenous knowledge or Black communities' knowledges across the globe or other marginalized communities, they don't have the same amount of information, their information, training their AI. So a responsible AI should take into consideration those marginalized knowledges that we cannot even see and putting them intentionally in the base so we would be able to have a broader repertoire. So that's the work we are doing here with our AI at Chama Adebi. We are building this AI data set considering also knowledge from indigenous and Black communities and making sure that people can have dialogues about questions, about references they don't even know because they've never been exposed to those references. So this would be a more responsible AI for me.
Mhm. And do you have any advice how companies can practically test whether the AI are fair, or whether they can check whether they reintroduce or reinforce biases?
Well, absolutely. I think it's basically build this data set with marginalized communities in the board, in the room. So because we are still, as humans now, I don't know if in the future if we'll have the same role, but we are the ones who are basically teaching these AI models and testing these AI models and training those AI models to be more efficient in answering us simple or difficult questions, but in a very fast way. We are training those models with the knowledge that are more visible to us, right? But there is a huge knowledge that is still invisible. And to make sure that we have a more invisible, knowledge also being added to your repertoire, you need to bring those people to the table. But not only to the table in terms of, let me put those people to test my model. But when you are designing the model, when you are building new features for your model, when you are scaling your model in different markets, make sure that you invite intentionally marginalized groups to the table and add their knowledge to your AI. Or even, with local partners. So we are partnering with other companies, with other tech companies, because we are an institution that is Black and Indigenous led, and we try to make sure that we build those models together with companies. So being very intentional in partnering with other local organizations and bringing marginalized groups to the table are great ways to broaden this repertoire for AI and humans.
In your view, if you advise policymakers, what should they be doing to make sure that AI really benefits everybody and not just some privileged few?
I think there are so many different ways to make AI more accessible for more people, and everybody wins with that. So it's not only like a philanthropic, approach or something like that. It should be in the core strategy of every company that wants to have their AI scaling in different markets. So basically making sure, as I was mentioning, that marginalized groups can use and shape this AI, making sure that institutions that are smaller, but also making efforts to make this topic more accessible for everybody. They are receiving right resources and robust resources, because what I see is like when people are talking about AI for good, they say, oh, we want to make AI for good. But I always ask how much your company is investing in other organizations or in this AI for good model. And usually the answer is not good. The answer for AI for good is not good, So they are saying that they are trying to make AI for good, but they are not investing in other organizations that are trying to make AI more accessible. So partnering with other organizations, and also setting like basically a great accountability in terms of setting guardrails for harm, and incentivizing and funding AI that creates public good, not only like just private profit. But also, I mean, there is an important thing for the government here. So we need to have a great regulation for AI. I mean, we always are in this discussion, especially here in Brazil, to set a regulation that obviously is open to innovation, because we're talking about something that is new for most of us, but also don't prevent companies to to get started. So it needs to be open to be very innovative in terms of doing new things, but we need to make that accessible for most of people, and not to prevent companies to start. So this is, I know that can be very tricky, but I think that's mostly done when you bring marginalized people to the table, because they are the ones who set the guardrails for harm, and they will tell you like, oh, if you do this, you harm my community, you harm my way of living. So you need to have a great sense of hearing those people in your designing process, either for policies or either for the AI models. And I don't think that's quite done yet, because usually the decision-making process, they don't take this into consideration. But I think we can still put that as part of the designing process for policies and for AI models.
I also want to talk briefly about your own leadership journey. I mean, you've worked in many different fields and achieved a lot. What was the hardest leadership lesson that you had to learn?
Wow, Philip, you're so intense. So the hardest leadership lesson. Wow, so many, so many. I think one of the hardest one. I consider myself a very resilient person. So I go there and I try to make my best, and and obviously there is also a team work behind, and obviously in the side that makes that work. But in the early days, I try a lot to do things by my own. And I think that maybe was one of the hardest lessons I've ever learned, that you cannot do things only by yourself, especially when you're trying to change a structure, as it is in our case. You need to ask for help. You need to ask for, you need to call someone. You need to, to see what Philip is doing, what Pradeep is doing. So how can we try to join forces? And obviously it's not easy, because we are in different contexts, but when you put things in place, that makes us stronger in terms of getting more resources, in terms of getting more attention, and in terms of scaling our impact. So I think I've been learning that more, and that's still ongoing, because it's like, if you go by yourself, you go faster, but if you go in a group, you go further. You go like you can move further. So that's
Yes.
an African dictate, but it's pretty much what most of us do. And we have to realize that we are doing things by our own because it's somehow easier. But you need to do more things in group to make this scalable.
And have there been any role models or sources of inspiration along your journey?
Absolutely. I mean, obviously, I can always mention my mom and grandma, because they were the ones that allow me to be here, not only biologically, but also in terms of philosophy, in terms of life. So my mom always told me to turn in, the no I would receive as answers in my whole life into yes. So that's why we invite the society to say yes to racial equality, to say yes to equality, yes to equal opportunities, and how we can make our world a better place for all of us. And that makes companies more profitable, and it's good for everybody. So it's not about it. It's not about doing a favor to the other, but to make a favor to yourself, to broaden your own repertoire, and to build a better place for you or your family and so on. So my family values, I think they're the core things for me, but also could mention other models. So here in Brazil there is like Sueli Carneiro, who was like a pioneer in terms of Black women leading an organization and using her voice to basically put marginalized people on the table. I can mention Ailton Krenak, which is an indigenous leader who is like also a great voice here talking about indigenous rights. I can talk about Barack Obama, which I was a volunteer for his campaign when I was in the university. I could also go to the University of Wisconsin, Madison, and I was there, and I was a volunteer, very inspired by his leadership and the way he would inspire people. It was like beyond politics. It was like very inspiring to see him talking about, his life, his wife, Michelle, and, so on. So it was very inspiring. So I can name a lot of role models that allowed me to be here in a direct or indirect way. But I think those are basically the inspiration, the oxygen that you go and look at when you kind of, feeling, disappointed or something. I still have them with me. I actually have a wall in my house with some of my role models, and my mom and grandma are there with Ailton Krenak. And whenever I feel like, oh my goodness, this is a day I don't feel enough energy, I look at the wall and say, well, if they made, I can make it. So the role models are very important for your life.
Mhm. And looking into the future, when you think about the Brazil that the next generation will inherit, what would you think, or what would you hope is different from today?
Yeah, I wanted to see like a place where you cannot, the race or the gender won't influence your choices in terms of careers anymore. So if you walk in a company in the Brazil in the future, I hope you cannot say, oh, this is the CEO and this is the cleaning lady, which happens today, right? So because of who you are and where you're born, sometimes you have very limited possibilities in terms of the career you may have, or the education you may have, or even the partners or the friends you may have. And I hope in the Brazil in the future, your possibilities and your narratives and possibilities will be a way broader, a way way less limited as it is now. So that's what I want, and that is what I fight for every day. Because today, when you arrive in Brazil, even if there is this myth that we are very mingled, and we are pretty much a miscegenated country, and people are getting together, and there is no war going on in Brazil. I mean, obviously, we can look at this and see a very naive kind of message ongoing, but this is a myth that a lot of people believe. But when you go and when you come here, which I hope you do one day, you come here and then you put your glasses and you see that with a little bit more criticism, you see most of Black and Indigenous people serving on a very poor and with limited options in terms of labor or education. And we are the majority of the country. And that's not fair. That prevents us to go from where we are to the country that can be a way more prosper and more, and bigger and so on. So I hope in the future, Brazil becomes a country where a child, for example, a child's race, gender, or zip code no longer dictates their opportunity.
And in a way, you already did this, but we like to always end our show on a positive note. So every guest gets the same question, which is, what makes you optimistic about the future?
Well, what makes me optimistic about the future is that we are having a dialogue now. And that could be something that can be perceived as something little, but, the world basically are made of details. And we are having a conversation about it. A person from Germany and a person from Brazil are talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Maybe in 15, 20 years ago, that wasn't even possible. And we are having this conversation now, and we are planting the seeds. And in the near future, we'll have even more advancements and things that we can't even think of. But I'm sure that if we are here today, someone dreamed of us having this conversation now. So what makes me optimistic is that our dialogue can also be the seeds of the new dialogues, the inclusive dialogues that people from different countries and races can have in the future, and different possibilities and partnerships that can bloom from a dialogue like ours.
Very true. I very much agree. So collaboration rather than confrontation. Yeah. Luana, thank you very much for joining us today on the show and for giving us all your insights around these complex topics: diversity, equity, inclusion, AI, climate, so many things we talked about, and for showing us how these topics actually shape our future. And to our listeners, stay tuned and stay curious, and join us again for the next episode of What's Next.